Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss some worrying signs over the current COVID data, especially around testing, as well as a government policy on reporting COVID cases that, although won't be causing major issues right now, is still odd and could increasingly skew perceptions later. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, two things I want to discuss here, really, but I think the more worrying one, the one that is very likely to be having an impact right now. If you look at the new cases per day in the UK, it's falling quite sharply. Can only be a good thing, right? If it's accurate, absolutely. But scientifically speaking, in order to draw any conclusions, you don't just go, oh, great, the rate's down, that's brilliant. You need to know what's going on. Are, for example, all the circumstances the same before? Are we comparing apples with apples here? It's quite easy to identify factors that could be impacting on the numbers, both upward pressures as well as downward pressures. What is much less easy, and impossible for me at the moment, the amount of information I have, is knowing how much of a factor each one is. For example, I've talked before about how the football had been the likely source of a huge surge in cases. 15,000 Scottish fans were believed to be infected after travelling to London to watch Scotland against England. Possibly the costliest goalless draw in British history. And then we think that a hell of a lot of people travelled to London for multiple Wembley games recently. So it makes sense that the football tournament ending would lead to an easing of pressure. Perhaps the numbers we have now are what it would have been without the tournament. But there are other factors as well. Last summer, cases dropped off largely because of the warmer weather. We weren't doing anywhere near enough to manage the spread of infection, apart from keeping the north of England under lockdown when everyone else was pretending that lockdown was over. North of England were going, hang on a minute, we still seem to be in lockdown. What's going on? But the warmer weather meant more people being in the well-ventilated outdoors at least. Well, we've had warmer weather recently as well. Perhaps this could also account for some of the drop-off. But the most worrying factor actually alludes to something a wise orange president once said. Would you believe that? There was wisdom there. Something along the lines of, I forget the exact words, if we didn't test as much, the numbers wouldn't look so bad. You know, when he was complaining that everyone was giving him stick for these horrendous numbers, it's because we're testing so much. We should stop testing as much and then the numbers wouldn't look as bad. Yeah, sure. The actual infections would, of course, be much worse because testing positive results in the vast majority isolating and not spreading their infection much further. Should be everyone, but, you know, that doesn't happen. Now, I'd also recently talked about how the rate of positivity for tests had gone up for a week or so. I think it's come down a bit now, but it had gone up for a week or so, which implied that fewer people were taking tests. Potentially because we ran out of lateral flow tests on so-called Freedom Day. So when it comes to people getting tested, there's several reasons why people may get a PCR test, which is the accurate one. The two main reasons would be that, because some people may need to take it, for example, to qualify for not having to quarantine after going somewhere else in the world. But let's talk about the two main ones. One main one would, of course, you come down with what could be symptoms, so you get yourself tested to be sure. The second reason is you take your lateral flow test. You haven't got symptoms, but you take your lateral flow test. That says you're positive. It's like, oh, okay, I might be positive. I'll get a PCR test. So if you run out of lateral flow tests, people are not taking as many lateral flow. Obviously, some people would have had some in stock. But that would mean way fewer people were taking lateral flow tests, which means way fewer people getting positive lateral flow tests, which means way fewer people asking for a PCR test. Now we've seen the figures. Well, I've seen the figures. Other people have seen it earlier. We're not testing as many people. And it's a lot less. Here's a chart I did, which shows the number of PCR tests conducted per day between the 21st of July, a couple of days after Freedom Day, to the 26th. And notice, I've not pulled a usual fast one. I know what people go with bar charts. You show all sorts of things on bar charts because you don't start your x-axis from zero. Very misleading there. No, the x-axis is at 0 on the y-axis. This chart shows the genuine proportion drop over the space of 6 days. The number of PCR tests dropped by 44%. Now that should be deeply worrying. We've known for a long time that testing is crucial to our action against the pandemic. Experts around the world were trying to drum this into the heads of government everywhere over a year ago, well over a year ago. Testing, testing and more testing, they said. Boris Johnson and his ministers spent weeks fiddling our own testing figures last year in an attempt to make it seem that they were on top of it. Remember one of the tricks they pulled? They counted each test as 2 tests. Because they argue there's 2 ends, isn't there? There's one that goes up your ureter and one that goes down your throat. That's 2 tests then, isn't it? If it's one person tested. Anyway, what's the reason? Well, there are 2 main possible reasons. Either we have less testing capacity, either because of problems getting supplies or because the government is deliberately scaling testing back, not using as many labs, that sort of thing. The other possible reason, of course, is fewer people coming forwards. On the latter point, so the guy who threw up the figures on social media that sort of attracted my attention on it, Alex Andrew, relayed an anecdotal explanation which suggested that people aren't coming forwards as much because, Freedom Day has persuaded them that the problem has gone away. And you could see how some would. If you believe that the government are acting in your interests, and a distressing number do, then of course you'd think that removing almost all safety measures means there's no longer a need for them. I mean, the logic is simple. The government is acting in our interests. They've removed a load of safety measures, ergo the safety measures are not needed. And so people developing symptoms now, which are really just symptoms of a cold anyway, will just put it down to a cold, some common or garden illness. But that's a hypothesis. I don't know if there's any evidence for that. I still wonder what impact has resulted on when the lateral flow tests were unavailable. So at the start of last week, you couldn't actually order any lateral flow tests. That drop in tests, as I said, would have meant a lower number of tests being taken over that following week, which is what this data is for. But for whatever the reason, and whatever the influence of various factors that can affect the numbers published for rate of infection, if your level of testing goes down by 44% in the same period of time where reported new cases only go down by 24%, you've got a testing problem. Because you could argue, well, if there is a genuine slowdown in infection, you'd expect fewer people to come forward to test, Phil. But the number of new cases per day has come down by 24% in the same period that testing has come down by 44%. Huge disparity. The reduction in tests is definitely not because fewer people needed them. It is absolutely down to either fewer people taking them than would have done under the same circumstances a week or 2 earlier, or availability. And again, whether that's availability of PCR tests or lab testing, or the lateral flow tests, which also catch some asymptomatic people, that I don't know. But that is one worrying sign that the data we are getting is not providing the information that we think it does. And there is another, albeit less serious situation right now. It won't be skewing the data now, but it could later. So I'm just going to come right out and say what this is about, then explain the problems it causes. So at the weekend, I saw a tweet from Robert Peston, who's a political editor on ITV. He relayed information he received from what he called a senior government official that said that the daily dashboard figures for new COVID infections don't actually include people that have previously been infected. So what that means is, let's say 2 people are infected with COVID. They get a PCR test, either because they have symptoms or a lateral flow test picked it up, whatever. They test positive because they are actually infected. What's the difference between them? They've both been infected. Does one have a chance to infect others but the other doesn't? No. Is one at risk of needing hospital treatment but the other not? No. But if one of them has never tested positive before, they go onto the official figures. When you see how many people, 30-odd thousand new people testing positive each day, they go on those figures. But if the other one tested positive a year ago, they don't, because they've already been on the system. How does that make sense? It doesn't. Now, before we all start going mad, right now, this doesn't make a big difference to the way the data is presented, because the actual numbers that this is affecting is not really that huge. It's quite small, really, compared to the number of new cases. But that is not to say it's all fine. After all, as this pandemic rolls merrily on, reinfections are going to become more common. We know that being infected with COVID doesn't make you immune. We know it doesn't stop you becoming infected again. During the first wave, we weren't really sure. And even when we heard stories of, like, let's say in Japan or China, of people getting reinfected, it was like, but were they, or had they just never recovered from the first? We didn't really know. Now we know. I mean, it stands to reason that with each new wave or surge within a wave, because we had 2 surges in the second wave and we're likely to get at least that many in the third wave, we will still have some people infected who have previously been infected. We know that becoming infected with COVID doesn't give you very good protection from reinfection. We've seen plenty of cases now where people have become reinfected weeks after recovering from the first. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Van Tam, also made it clear that recovering from infection gave a very poor level of protection for reinfection compared to full vaccination. And we're seeing plenty of double vaccinated people in hospital with COVID. The vaccine massively improves your chances, which is why the death rate, though still very high by the standards of things that normally kill people, is still way lower than the equivalent rate during previous waves. But if we think that this pandemic is here for a while yet, of course more and more people are going to be infected that have tested positive before. This policy of splitting new infections with reinfections could serve some useful research purpose. I'm not saying that there aren't some people who will want the data splitting up, absolutely. But not having them combined again for the dashboard figures that we get each day is just misleading, because it's not actually a reflection of the number of people who've tested positive. And like I say, the numbers are currently such that it's not affecting the trends we're seeing right now. It's not accounting for the dip down. If you put them back in, you'd not really see the difference. But in a year's time, and I know it's distressing to think of this still being here in a year's time, but remember, until the whole world has beaten it, no one's beaten it. But in a year's time, it could be skewing figures significantly. Just like the lack of testing may well be responsible for skewing the figures now. May well be responsible for people thinking that we've passed the peak of the third wave, that it's all getting better, because it's coming down sharply. Doubly dangerous thinking that if it causes fewer people to get tests, especially given the pressure on people not to get tests. We really should be doing more to encourage people to get tested, and we don't. We already had a problem with people not getting tested because they didn't want to test positive because they couldn't afford the time off work due to our piss poor statutory sick pay. And the so-called grant the government talk about seems to be quite hard to qualify. You'd think testing positive for COVID would do it. Apparently that's not always the case. But with people also wanting to enjoy the summer outdoors, whether because you imagine someone who's booked a holiday abroad, spent the money, do they want to get a test for just what they think? It's probably just a cold. I mean, yes, or they might just want to enjoy the sun around here. Again, it might be, do I really want to be stuck? I want to go out with my mates. I want to go to the pub. It's probably just a cold. There's no need for a test. Of course, if it was probably just a cold, you would get tested anyway, just to be sure. But that's not how the brain works, is it? And yes, we do get sun here, far too much for my liking. It was bad again yesterday. It's not so bad today. But there we are. Do the figures actually represent what they would have done a few weeks ago? Or has it been skewed due to either perceptions, fewer people coming forward for tests because there's extra pressures for them to not test positive, or because of the lateral flow shortage that we had? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.